So the first session today is a discussion around attracting diverse talent. We have from right to left, Ginny Waugh, Carol Williams and Pip Wells. And we're going to be sort of really exploring this whole discussion around attracting diverse talent into the procurement world. So let's kick off. Ginny, you're with British Land. So what are the ways you're going about sort of recruiting and bringing people into British Land? And how is the team coping with maybe approaching things in a different way?
Okay, so yes, you're right. I'm at British Land, and British Land are a real estate organisation. And when I joined British Land, it was a very different kind of culture and environment to that which I'd been used to from previous roles. And yes, it was, as was described by the recruitment consultant, very male-dominated and quite a traditional kind of old-style environment. It's changed dramatically in the 7 years I've been there. I don't think because of me, but hopefully I have been fairly instrumental in some of the change for good. And we look at diversity in a very, very broad context. So we're not just looking at the protected characteristics that are often talked about. And obviously, diversity has become very much more sophisticated over the years and very much more of a focus away from gender diversity, which was always the kind of go-to. So we want to employ a wide range of people, and the reason we want to do that is because we're serving a very wide range of customers. We have retail, we have commercial offices, and we're now moving into logistics. So very, very different customers, both in terms of our tenants and also in terms of the actual people who are spending money within our assets. So during COVID, of course, that was a game changer for many. Can't believe we're still talking about it. But it drove some really positive change, and many of which we've tried to kind of keep in place. So we started playing around with blind CVs, which was quite an interesting concept. And we were quite cautious to start with, but very much kind of focusing on the what the candidate could bring to the role rather than their education and their background, which had previously been driven by the kind of classic curriculum vitae approach. But we had to put quite a significant amount of work into training the hiring managers because this was a new concept that people weren't used to. It's quite unnerving when you get this kind of information coming out. And one of the funny stories is that I actually recently ended up hiring an outgoing procurement manager's wife for a role without realising, which was a happy ending because she's amazing, but I had absolutely no idea of the connection between the two, other than I thought, she's really up on British Land, she's done amazing homework. And then I think the other thing is flexibility around interviews. So during COVID, we were offering some more kind of flexible ways for interviewing, different locations, different time slots. You know, people don't want to bunk off work to attend an interview. And so you immediately start to enrich the pool of talent that you're fishing in. And then the last thing really is about kind of having a much more open conversation about dress code. I think, you know, there's very much a traditional sense of what one should wear for an interview, and giving people permission to wear something that they're comfortable in. It just starts to kind of break down some barriers. And for me, the most critical thing about recruiting anybody is really setting up that psychological safety that is so important to everybody in the workplace. So that's just a few tidbits of some of the things that we've been doing at BL.
And you talked there about getting the people who are doing the recruitment to change. And was that training for them, or how did you get them to really try and think differently when they're approaching an interview as a recruiter?
Yeah, so I think it's been difficult. One of the things that we have done is that we have made sure that we've had a very mixed interview team. Right. So you have the classic kind of HR representative, but then also making sure that we present ourselves as a diverse organisation. So it's not kind of like a lip service situation. So again, we all know that there's a tendency to recruit people that are like yourself. So we've tried, and you tend to get teams of, you know, similar people. So trying to bring in different people from other parts of the organisation, and also because procurement is such a embedded part of British Land, bringing in the customers as well. So bringing in people from our development team, people from our legal team, actually makes sure that you don't just keep repeating the same kind of type of people, and therefore you're narrowing down your kind of diverse thinking.
Right. So Pip, I mean, from your perspective, you know, consultants supporting organisations in this space. Is what was described there was a great example of how to do it. Is that what you're seeing others doing, and are there examples that you can bring to life of how people go about doing this?
Yeah, it's really interesting actually, Ginny, what you just mentioned about dress code and interviews, because I think, we've looked at about 20 organisations to date to understand where bias exists within the recruitment process. And one of the sort of common sort of traps that organisations fall into is actually saying things like, did that candidate have a strong handshake? Did they maintain eye contact? Now, we know that these are things that neurodiverse candidates can actually struggle with, but people might not be aware of that. So it's bringing awareness to that, and we sort of coin that as innocent ignorance, because people obviously aren't meaning to do this. I'd say other examples we've seen, I'll give you two. One is sort of low-hanging fruit, and another's sort of a bit more long-term. Something that I've seen more and more organisations start to do is actually understand what the data, what the academia says, and then applying that to the recruitment process. So, for example, we know that women are more likely to apply to a role when they meet 100% of the criteria. For men, that figure is just 60%. Now, companies such as Legal & General, if you actually have a look at their job descriptions, they've just added a couple of sentences, which is, we know that sometimes some groups might not apply to a job if they don't meet 100% of the criteria. Well, why not apply anyway? This costs absolutely nothing to sort of, put into play. And I just think this is something that we should all be doing and encouraging. I'd say my second example, and I guess it's sort of part of a larger conversation at the moment, is just stop asking candidates their current salary. It is the biggest thing that you can do to stop minimizing bias as part of the recruitment process. What you're doing essentially is inheriting a previous bias from a former employer rather than paying that candidate what they're deemed to be worth. We know that as we're creating these, these jobs, we already have a salary range in mind. The government's currently trialling this at the moment, so it'll be interesting to see what results come out when they're published later this year.
And does that link in from a blind CV perspective? Is that the same sort of approach? I mean, how much do you take off? So,
Yeah.
so when you look at the CV, just what's left? Is it just the roles that they've done?
It's very much about their experience. So education comes off. Obviously,
Right.
anything personal about, age hasn't been on there for some time, but, where they live, where they've come from. It's very difficult to inhibit that desire to go on LinkedIn, and play the game of guess the candidate.
Yeah.
It's quite, and that's what we found ourselves doing, which is, can you trace that path of identity?
Right.
But it's very much about it's actually a more holistic approach because you have less information. It doesn't mean that you can't seek that more information during the interview process, but then it's down to the candidate as to how much they share with you.
Right, so at least you're starting without those preconceived
Exactly.
views in there.
You've got them in the room.
Yeah, and I suppose the salary is one of those examples.
Yeah.
Of at least thinking, well, are they overqualified because they've been overpaid or whatever it might be that's in there.
Yeah, and it's actually really interesting when it comes to anonymised CVs. We always encourage organisations to pilot this first. We trialled this with our international banking client. We actually found that in some cases it can disadvantage young females, and that was echoed by the Australian government. So it does obviously work though in the majority of cases. So we would always advise clients to actually pilot this on a smaller scheme, and then if it's successful, roll it out and use data to guide you.